So I'll switch to English. I think the presentations will be in English, right? I think there are only like Portuguese speakers here, but maybe some foreigner will jump in at some point. Well, welcome to the session, the Swiss program in global issues for development, right? I want to thank you very much, Heitor and Rafael, for accepting the invitation to present the paper. Everyone present great papers. And I mean, they're all structural papers about frictions in the labor markets, okay? And I'll start talking about football here, okay? I'll try to keep track of my own time, but please let me know if I'm like losing track. So I'll talk about non-compete contracts, wages, and efficiency, and this is joint work with Bernardo and Bernardo Guimarães and Vladimir Konchek from FGV, okay? So, non-compete covenants. This is a type of labor mobility friction, right? It restricts or prohibits a worker from leaving a job to join a competitor. So, for example, like the CEO from Pepsi cannot immediately quit and become the CEO from Coca-Cola, for example. Right? They have like a contractual arrangement that prevents this from happening. This is more likely in high skill paying jobs like workers in high-tech industries, like CEOs and professional athletes, but this is also present in low skill paying positions. Right? In the US, in 2014, 18% of the labor force were bound by non-competes, and 38% had agreed to non-competes at some point. And guys, feel free to ask questions along the way. Okay? So in this paper, what we're going to do, we're going to study how non-compete agreements affect the market for professional footballers in Brazil. How are wages and turnovers affected? And how are there any changes in employer-employee match efficiency due to these non-compete frictions? Well, why are we studying this market, right? It's generally difficult to study the impacts of labor mobility frictions, including non-competes. There are many endogeneity issues, confounders, generic equilibrium effects, and spillovers to other sectors and occupations. And I think we think that an advantage in our case is that the market for professional footballers is relatively small and close. So we have like a small, good lab here to study this type of friction. It's going to be easier to dismiss like confounders and generic equilibrium effects. And also we expect little spillover effects to other sectors and occupations. And the second reason is that there was a relevant change in the labor market, right, for professional footballers in Brazil. Before 1998, players could not freely move to other clubs by the end of the contracts, right? And this changed with the Pelé Act in 1998. So Pelé was the Minister of Sports at the time, and this act removed this type of non-compete friction. So players were allowed to move to whatever clubs they want by the end of the contracts. What we're going to do, we're going to be using matched employer-employee data to estimate how wages and turnovers are adjusted to the Pelé Act for different stages in players' careers. We're going to build a model and use the data to estimate its key parameters, okay? And the model itself, it's bringing some methodological contribution here, right? It's a novel model. It is a model with individual workers and random worker firm matches that's going to be suitable for like more general setups, where we have like long-term contracts between firms and workers, where match efficiency and wages are state variables, and where information asymmetry implies inefficiency in transfers, okay? Contribution to the literature, very quick here, right? We're mainly contributing to the literature studying the effects on non-competes on mobility and earnings, right? And we think you are the first structural model, right? Studying this kind of setup. Like with non-competes, then quantitatively assessing the implications of a plausibly exogenous policy shift.
Can I ask you something, João Paulo? I think that the Pelé Act changes other things than only that non-compete thing. Yeah. I think it was a one-shot intervention that probably changed the whole scenario about transfers among soccer clubs. So how are you going to isolate that non-compete thing you want to study?
Yeah, I mean, there are many like issues in the Pelé Act, you're right. For example, even bingo, I mean, the act is even affecting bingos, for example. And it's changing like financial practices for clubs as well, trying to bring better management to clubs. But I mean, like reading the act, I think the main thing affecting the payment of workers, right, directly, it's related to this type of non-compete friction, right? Of course, I mean, it might be that there is like the secondary effects of the other aspects of the law is going to have some implications for the payment of workers. But if like you check the act, I think this is clearly the main thing affecting the payment of workers. Okay. But I mean, again, if there is anything from the law that's indeed affecting things very striking, we don't believe that's the case. I mean, this is going to be a confounder here. Okay. Good. So jumping to the model, there are going to be players indexed by I that are going to live for n periods. When a player I is matched with club J at time t, they're going to generate output yi cj mu t. What are these components, right? Well, yi is going to be player's ability, and this is going to be fixed and known throughout time. In the equilibrium, all prices and values are going to be proportional to this yi, and this is not playing like a major role in the model here. Cj, on the other hand, is very important. It's going to be a factor specific to the player and team match. This is going to be a reduced form for why clubs and players choose each other. So you can think, for example, you have like a very good striker in the market, like Pedro from Flamengo, okay? And you have like a team A that also has very good strikers. So maybe Pedro is not a very good match for this team A. But imagine that you have a team B and team B's main striker just got injured. So maybe Pedro is a good match for team B. It's going to have a high CJ for team B and a low CJ for team A. Again, you can think about many possibilities for why these CJs are changing, right? But this is just a reduced form for why clubs and players are going to choose each other, okay? And UT is going to be a time-dependent productivity factor. That's going to be constant for all players of age T. And this is a parameter that's going to be known by all the agents and it's going to help us to fit some parts of the model. Continue the setup at time t equals 1. What's happening? So the player is free in the market at time t equals 1, and they're going to draw 2 clubs. The players are going to draw 2 clubs. These clubs are going to have match factors Cj and Ck that are going to be drawn from a distribution F tilde of C. So these clubs are going to engage in a second price auction to compete for the player and where the higher wage offer wins. And then the winning club and the player sign a contract and start producing. For t greater than 1, right? Imagine that club J actually won the auction and acquired the player, right? So there's going to be a shock to the match factor productivity, Cj, at every point in time. This is changing stochastically. Also, another club, club K, may arrive at every point in time to try to poach the player. So another club is going to be drawn, and this new club is going to have match factor productivity Ck that is going to be drawn from distribution F of C. An important thing here in the model, there's a symmetry of information. So player and club J, they know Cj, club K knows Ck, but club K does not know Cj, and club J does not know Ck. Okay, so there's an asymmetry of information here, and it's going to bring in be bringing in efficiency in the model, as you're going to see soon. There's also like a probability that the contract expires at every point in time, right? So the contract with club J is valid with the probability delta t. So contract expires with probability 1 minus delta t. And 2 things can happen, right? Every point in time. If the contract does not expire, if the contract is valid, the club may want to sell the player in that situation, and it needs to set a transfer, T. Okay. The player may want to be transferred as well. Is going to demand some wage offer like WK, okay, from the new club. And the club K is going to arrive, is going to see the wage demanded by the player, the transfer demanded by the club, and we're going to decide whether to buy the player or not, if the contract is valid. If the contract is not valid, there's going to be an auction between clubs J and K. And the auction is going to be different between the pre and post Pele Act. In the post Pele Act, the player is kind of free to choose whatever club he wants. So the clubs that are going to engage in a second price symmetric auction. In the pre-Pele Act scenario, things are slightly different. Right? Club K is going to have to pay a transfer to acquire the player from Club J. okay? Because the player is attached to Club J, and Club J is going to demand some transfer to release the player. And we're just going to assume that this transfer fee is proportional to the bid paid by Club K. I want to talk more about the auction soon. Well, and the timing of the model, right? At every point in time, this is happening, okay? And so we also get used to the notation of the value functions that I'm going to be using in the model. So the beginning of a time, the contract may still valid or expire. If the contract is valid, I'm going to call the value function W tilde for the player and V tilde for the club. If the contract expires and it's not valid anymore, the value functions are going to be U tilde and L tilde. Sorry, L hat. And this hat is just like taking into account the uncertainty relative to CJ, okay, which at that point in time hasn't changed. Remember, CJ is changing every point in time. After this like uncertainty related to CJ is realized, so the club J knows CJ, so the value functions are going to be W and V if the contract is valid for the player and the club, and U and L if the contract is not valid anymore. And at that point, like the clubs are going to decide whether to transfer the players or not. And after any transfers take place, the clubs are going to move to a new club or stay in the old club, and it's going to produce. So the end of the period value functions are going to be X and Y. And what are they? Value function for the player, X. It's going to be a function of the match factor productivity, CJ, and wages. So the player will be producing and will be getting the wage, W, and it's going to be discounted the future by beta. With some probability delta T, the contract is still valid, and in the future, the worker is going to enjoy W hat, right, in the next period. And if the contract has expired, right, this happens with probability 1 minus delta tilde, the worker is going to enjoy U tilde. For the club, things work in a similar fashion, but the club gets the production of the worker and has to pay the wage for the worker. So we're going to discount the future by the same rate beta. With probability delta T, the contract is valid and it enjoys V tilde. With probability 1 minus delta T, the contract is not valid and it enjoys L tilde. And let's define the valuation, the total valuation of the match, which is the sum of the surplus of the worker and the firm, as Z, which is going to be X plus Y. And just anticipating the result of the model, that's going to simplify our life. This is going to be independent of wages, right? So Z does not going to depend on the wage.
Question?
Follow. Go ahead. Follow.
So you've been using this terminology that the contract is valid. And I can only see here that there's a delta T shock for this validity of the shock. Can you elaborate on this? I mean, the length of the contract is not an endogenous variable. This is not a decision variable.
This is
and
not
how are you thinking about
variable. Yeah. I mean, the contract is just like a payment for the worker between the worker and the player, indeed. And at every point in time, there's some probability that this is going to expire. But this is not like the length of the contract is not going to be an endogenous decision in the model. It's just like a parameter.
This delta T is a parameter to be estimated and it's taken as completely exogenous.
Exactly. Okay. This, I mean, might be important indeed, right? Like, but we're abstracting from it here.
It's also common across, and it's common across pairs.
It's common across pairs, yeah, but it changes over time, yes. Okay. Good. So after like, okay, transfers, right? So just before the end of the period when the contract is still valid. So Club J is going to demand some transfer. So it's going to maximize this function V, which is also a function of C and the W, and the wage W. And it's also a function of this C bar. What is C bar? C bar is going to be the minimum threshold level that the new Club K needs to have to acquire the player from Club J. So every Club K that's arriving with a CK greater than C bar is going to be able to buy the player from Club J, okay, and not in the other case. So the function that Team J is maximizing, right, it's going to be this one. With probability f of C bar, right, the CK is going to be lower than C bar, and the player is going to stay in Club J. And Club J is going to enjoy the Y, which is the surplus of the match for the club. With probability 1 minus f of C bar, the player is going to move to the new club. And in this case, the player got the transfer T, which is defined by this expression here. This is simply saying that the Club K that has the threshold level C bar as the productivity match factor is indifferent between selling the player or not. Okay, it gets like a 0 from this transaction. It gives the surplus to the club. J. For the players, things work in a similar fashion. Like I have W with probability of F of C bar, the player stays in club J and the player enjoys X, and the expected value of a transfer to a new club K is given by this integral here, right? And the player is going to be transferred if the new CK is going to be greater than C bar. Okay. And from here, I mean, we can solve numerically for C bar and WK, right, using the 2 first order conditions from the model and obtain the W's and the V's. And like going back to the result that I mentioned before, right, in the paper, we show that the minimum efficiency level required for the transfer to C bar does not depend on the current wage. So you could think that like clubs paying really high wages to a worker for a given C would be like desperate to sell the player and would be accepting a lower C bars to transfer the player. But this is not the case here. Clubs paying higher wages, right, will accept lower transfers, but the level of C bar does not depend on the wage settled in contract. And this is going to make our life easier because to solve the transfer problem, we don't need to keep track of wages here. And this result also implies that the future path of a player does not depend on the wage settled, right? Since the C bar is not affected by wages, the future allocation of workers are not being affected by C bar, affected by wages. Wages are simply splitting the surplus between firms and workers here, right? The total, so in the end, the total surplus from the match, the Z, is not going to depend on wages here. Okay. And again, this simplifies our things considerably because in some situations we don't have to keep track of wages to solve for the transfers and for the auctions. And mentioning the auctions, right, where I think it's where all the action in the model is, things are different in the post-PELEC scenario and the pre-PELEC scenario. In the post-PELEC scenario, the club is going to choose the bidding, right? Bid is how much they're offering the worker, okay? This is how much they want to pay for the worker here. And they're going to maximize this value function L. This is a very standard second price auction, right? In the post-PELEC scenario. These are symmetric because in this case, the worker is free to choose whatever club he wants. So if club BJ wins the auction, so with probability, some probability, BJ is going to be greater than BK. So team J just enjoys the Z, which is the valuation of the match, and needs to pay something for the worker, which is going to be the expected value of the losing bid, which is the expected value of BK, given that BJ was greater than BK. Same thing for 14K. Very standard second price auction, like bidding the valuations is still a dominant strategy. So teams just bid their valuations here. From here, we get the L's and the U's. In the pre-PELEC scenario, we have a non-standard second price auction. The clubs are going to choose the bids, to maximize the L still, but the function is slightly different, right? This first component is the same as we had before, so with some probability, club J wins the auction, enjoys the Z, it needs to pay something for the worker, right? The expected value of BK, given that BK is lower than BJ. But if the club loses the auction, if club J loses the auction, it's going to get some payment from club K, which is this final component here. So if PJ is lower than BK, happens with some probability, it gets PJ, which in this case is a losing bid, multiplied by this phi, which is a parameter that we're going to estimate. For club K, right, club K needs to pay this transfer if it wins the auction, right? So it enjoys that if it wins the auction, it needs to pay something for the worker, right? Which is this one, multiplied by the expectation of BJ, given that BJ is lower than BK, plus the phi that's paid to club J if club K wins the auction. We can see here, we can find an analytical solution for the bid of club K, which is given by Z divided by 1 plus 5. So you see that here, club K is being less aggressive in its bids compared to the previous case where the club just bid at Z. Okay, so this is being divided by 1 plus 5. For team J, we need to solve things numerically using the first order condition, and from here we get the L and the U's. And what's behind the auction here? What's changing? when we move from a world with non-compete agreements, right, where a world without non-compete agreements, where phi's are equal to 0, to a world with non-compete agreements, where phi is greater than 0. We're going to be moving from an efficient third and second price auction, right, to an efficient auction with transfers. In a world with non-competes, both teams are going to bid less aggressively. This implies that players are getting a lower share of the surplus, right, and clubs are benefiting from it. Club K is going to bid less aggressively because it needs to pay a transfer if it wins the auction. Club J is also going to bid less because now losing is not so bad. It gets some transfer when it loses the auction, so it's going to be less aggressive. But it's going to bid slightly higher than K, right? So in the world with no compete, it's going to bid more than K because it internalizes that if it increases its bids a little bit, it's going to get some payment when it loses the auction. So all the action here is in the auction. Transfers, right? In the transfer setup, transfers are going to go up indirectly a little bit as well because I mean, since players are getting a lower share of the surplus, clubs are getting a higher share, so the Ys are going up. So transfers are going to be increasing. But it's going to increase for everyone. So one club is going to be willing to charge more for the players, the other clubs are going to be willing to pay more for the players. These things kind of cancel out. So our C bar, which could be bringing more an efficiency difference between the pre and post tax scenarios when the contract is still valid, it's not going to play much action here. The C bar is going to be basically unchanged when we look at our empirical application. Okay. Any questions about the model? Okay.
Yeah, I have a question. Can you explain a little bit better, like more how where is the source of inefficiency? How going from one type of auction to the other, you're gonna change the efficiency of the system?
Here, I mean, because in the, let's say, in the auction, in the post-tax period, right, the higher C gets the player. It's kind of everything is kind of symmetric, right? So the team with the higher C gets the player. Okay, so this is efficient in this sense. In the pre-act scenario, I mean, since like one club kind of owns the player, right? For this team that's owning the player, if it has like a slightly low, if it has a low, let's say some level of C, the new team would need to have like a slightly higher C to actually acquire the player, okay? And this is the inefficiency that's arising in the model. And this is because it needs to pay this transfer, right, to actually acquire the player. So this is the inefficiency that's arising in the auction. There is the new club needs to have a higher C to acquire the player, and this does not happen in the post-tax period without a non-compete. Okay. Is it clear? Okay.
Yeah. I think we can discuss later, but I have some thoughts about this. Yeah, good.
Okay, so moving to our empirical application, right? The Pele Act. So the Pele Act basically took place in 1998 and it allowed transfers without fees by the end of the contracts. This was similar to the Bosman ruling that happened in the EU in 1995. And before that, like when the contract expired, clubs were attached, so players were attached to clubs, and the clubs needed to agree to release the player. We have a statement from Zinho, which was in our World Champions squad in 1984. At the time, the major problem was when big clubs came to hire me, like Inter Milan, Benfica, and Flamengo, wouldn't sell me, and I had to stay. Sometimes the offer was not good for the club, but it was good for me, even after the contract expired. I had to stay in the club, almost slavery. So you can see that this friction was preventing labor mobility. The data. We use standard data, HICE, which has been used by many of you, I'm sure. It's going to be matched employer-employee data. We're going to get annual information on earnings, turnover, and social demographics. We're going to be considering the pre-Pele Act period, 1996 and 1997, and the post-Pele Act period, 1999 to 2000. HICE does not identify players, football players until 2021, right? We don't have a specific occupational code for football players until 2021. But we identified professional athletes back then. So in our setup, we're going to be considering a football player, a professional athlete that's male, aged between 18 to 35 years old, matched with a firm that employed at least one football player in 2002. And we're also going to be focusing on like teams in that like fluctuate between series A and B. So we're kind of trying to focus really on football players, and we get a good match in this sense. And we're going to be considering like players with high labor force attachment. We're going to be using always in players that have no gap years as football players. And this is our main empirical finding. So if we plot the average earnings of workers by age in the pre-Pele Act period and in the post-Pele Act period, this is what we get. So we're basically getting that younger workers lost with the act. Okay, so the red line, which is in the post-act period, wages have players have lower wages here, and as players get older, the wages increase more in the post-act period. So the older workers benefited from the act. Okay. So this is going to be our main empirical finding. What are we claiming here? That the act changed the age earnings profile in that way that I've just shown. Okay, like older workers benefit, younger workers lost with the act. And these results hold when we control for player fixed effects that account for potential compositional changes, when we consider changes in the age earning profiles in similar occupations to account for overall shifts in the economy, when we look at pre-existing trends and take into account the transition period of the act, we can still see that the results are still there. So we don't believe that quantitatively the effects are exactly the ones we observe here, but we believe that the Pele Act changed the age earning profile in this fashion. And this is what we're going to try to match with the model. Turnovers, in terms of turnovers, the Act increased turnovers a little bit as expected, especially for younger workers and not much for older workers. Estimation. Very quickly, not getting to the details of the estimation, but we're trying to match moments of the model to their data counterparts. We're going to try to match observed turnovers by age, observed wages by age, and for wages, we remove the fixed effects before and adjust for inflation. And we're going to be using the post-act period only to try to match these moments. And this is the fit we get in the model. So we are able to match like the age earnings profile and the turnovers age profile reasonably well in the post-act period. Well, maybe this is not very surprising, right? I mean, these are the moments we're trying to match. But now we're changing one single parameter that's related to the Pele Act, the phi, and try to match the wages and turnovers in the pre-Pele Act period. Okay. We're going to calibrate the phi to be equal to 0.1 because this is the one that gives a better fit. And this is what we get in terms of wages. So the volatile lines are the data, the smooth lines are the ones from the model, the blue is the post-act period, the yellow is the pre-act period. So you can see that we're able to get that younger players actually lost from the act and older players gained. And why this is happening in the model? Well, for older workers, remember, like in the auction, clubs are being more aggressive in the post-act period. So this tends to increase wages. And this is the effect that's dominating for older workers. For younger workers, remember that like a worker is an asset for the firm here, right? And in the pre-act period, this asset value is higher. Why? Because, I mean, in the pre-act period, the worker needs to only
Ixi, sou eu que congelei ou foi o João?
Acho que foi o João.
Também não. Também.
Aconteceu da outra sessão, todo mundo caiu e voltou depois.
É, todo mundo caiu. Okay, guys, are you able to see the PDF?
Tá.
Yes.
Okay,
Yes.
cool. So very quickly.
Can I have one question before you resume the presentation? So differences are statistically different, both the estimated and the model. The reduced form, they are statistically different, though.
Yeah, the data, yes, but you mean from the model, we haven't checked. Yeah, but, okay. Is that your question?
Because they are too close among earlier young players. They're too close to the model.
You mean the model, right?
I guess for both, but the model.
In the model, I mean, in the data we have like we have like a lot of observations, right? So I mean, they are statistically different, at least for some periods. But for the model, we haven't checked. We could check that, but it's a bit tricky to calculate the standard errors here. But I mean, let me just resume the presentation, right? So sorry, I didn't have time to go too much of the intuition of this. For the turnovers, we don't do like a very good match. I mean, but we still match the turnovers increased during this period. And we find that most of the effects that are arising here are coming from distribution of forces, not for efficiency. The efficiency effects in the model are quite minor, okay? And guys, I think this is my time. Sorry, I have to skip a little bit, but this is what I have to say. Thank you very much.
Okay.
And now Heitor is going to be presenting, right?
Yes. Let me put it here. Should I share my screen?
John, I think you have to stop sharing, otherwise
yeah,
it will. Yeah.
Good. Thanks.
Okay, do you have my screen full mode, or do you have it like only part of it?
Not in presentation mode.
It's not in presentation mode.
No.
Okay, so how do I do that? So
Sometimes Control L works for that. Sometimes.
okay, I have it here. No. Oof. Yeah, because usually I have two desktops, and then I put full screen mode before sharing the screen, and that typically works. So let's try the Control L. How does it look?
No. Do you have a Mac, or?
But I think it's fine. At least
okay.
for me, I'm able to read everything. So if you want to continue like this, for me, it's fine.
Me as well. For me as well. But,
okay. Okay. Yeah, I have a Mac. So if anyone has a suggestion here, we can use it. So yeah, let's go like this. I should have known without my other desktop. I should have prepared for this. But anyway, okay. So first of all, thanks a lot, João, for organizing this section. I was very excited about the opportunity of presenting here to so many people that are very familiar with this institutional context. And this paper is together with Sebastian Sotelo. And here we are interested in understanding how changes in migration costs, they can shape the comparative advantage in a country. So as we know, the comparative advantage can be defined as the differences in the relative cost of producing different goods in the economy. And it's important to understand it because it determines the trade patterns of the country and the gains from trade. Recently, there has been a couple of papers documenting that comparative advantage that they evolve substantially over time, but we still have very limited understanding of the specific mechanisms that are driving this evolution. And in this paper, we start with the observation that internal migrations, they are often tied to large sectoral changes in the economy. We have several examples in history, in the US, in China recently, with the new migration of workers to the exporting clusters. And based on this observation, we're gonna ask, how do migration costs shape the regional and aggregate comparative advantage? We are gonna consider three different mechanisms here. First, the fact that migration is gonna affect the allocation of workers across regions that have different productivities within the country. Also, the fact that migration affects the land to labor ratio across regions, which is related to Hessian rolling forces, fractal proportion forces. And finally, we are also going to consider that workers are themselves heterogeneous. They have different knowledge about how to produce different goods in the economy. And that migration is going to affect the allocation of those heterogeneous workers across regions in the country. We're going to put those different mechanisms into a quantitative spatial economy model and study this policy-driven episode of internal migration which will be familiar to you guys. So the episode is that we are going to study is the expansion of the agricultural frontier in Brazil, which is often called the March to the West. And this is a period in which the share of the population living in the West increased from 7% to 15% between 1950 and 2010. And we are going to document 3 facts related to this episode. First, that there has been big changes in Brazil's agricultural exports, and that the expansion of the economy of the West was key for this transformation. Second, we are going to show that within the West, when we look at particular crops, there are big differences in terms of what crops are more exposed to migrants from the East. And finally, we are also going to show that the productivity of migrants, they are strongly associated with the characteristics of the regions where they come from. And then we are going to, based on those facts, we're going to set up an overlapping generation model of trade and migration, in which workers are going to be heterogeneous as they are going to acquire productivities that are based on the region of origin. And then in this setting, the comparative advantage in our model is going to be a combination of natural advantage, the land to labor ratio, and the workers' productivity in terms of the composition of the knowledge that they are bringing into a given region. And then to quantify the model, we are going to use a combination of estimation and calibration. And the model is going to match the evolution of the economy between 1950 and 2010. And then once we have this model estimated for this period, calibrated for this period, we're going to run a counterfactual in which we allow for no changes in migration costs since the 50s. And we look at this counterfactual economy and compare with the baseline to see the effects that those migration costs had in the economy. Okay, but before moving directly to the empirical patterns, we derive a couple analytical results in the model to understand the effects of migration costs. First, we show that the migration costs, the effects of migration costs and comparative advantage are actually in principle ambiguous. You could have a situation in which the initial location of workers across regions is already in line with the comparative advantage of a country, that allowing them to choose where they are going to live, attenuate this initial relationship. And then we are also going to show that there exists a sufficient statistic for the impact of migration costs on the patterns of specialization, which is related to the exposure to migrants. I'm going to spend some time on this later. Okay, then going back to the empirics, we ask, using our model, we are going to ask what were the effects of these changes in migration costs between the East and the West of Brazil since the 50s on the Brazil's patterns of trade. And the first result that it finds that the migration costs are substantial. They drop by 60%, and they account for about 55% of the migration to the West. So the rest is going to be explained by the increases in productivity, the increases in trade costs, but the migration cost also accounts for a big part of this migration. And then the migration of workers to the West, as induced by those reductions in migration costs, we find that they increase the Brazil specialization soy, cattle, and corn by 30%. And as we know, those are crops that are a flagship commodities in Brazil nowadays. And then our model, the worker heterogeneity, which is due to our model, they accounts for about 15% of those effects in a decomposition exercise that we do. And then finally, I'm probably not going to have time for this, but we also study what were the effects of the migration on the gains from trade. We find large heterogeneous effects across regions, but quite limited effects in the aggregate because some of those effects cancel each other. And if I have time, I can discuss in details the reasons for that.
Question?
Okay, so this is the setting. Yeah, go ahead.
So Ito, here, I mean, this is, I think you have to think about this as supply and demand, right? So you're going to have demand changing in the West with technological progress and Brapa and all that. But you also have labor supply changing because of these changes in trade costs, right? So I'm just trying to think here, when you go to the empirics, how are you going to be disentangling these two forces? Because that's a system in equilibrium.
That's correct. So the way how we are going to do this is we have data on production, on trade, and we are going to parameterize trade costs. We are going to match the production data. And then some of those transformations, they are going to be implicit in the productivities that we recover from the model. So for example, we do see that the productivity of soybeans in the West is increasing over time. And this is, we are recovering this from a model inversion. And the trade costs are also dropping, and we are using data on trade costs within the country and also international trade data to estimate this. So we are taking care about, we are accounting for the changes in productivities, changes in trade costs, changes in land supply as well, because there were some land grants. So we have a production function from the land supply, which can change the productivity over time. So this would be capturing the fact that the government is creating some land grants in the region. So we are gonna account for many of those things, and then we are only looking at the isolated effect of migration costs. We are not looking at the, but we are definitely acknowledging that those things are also going to be important. That's why the migration costs do not explain all the migration to the West, explain just part of it. Okay, so I have limited time, but here we are looking at contributing to two big literatures, one in trade and economic geography. We are looking at effects of migration costs on regional and aggregate comparative advantages, innovation relative to this literature. And the second literature is the literature in migration productivity. It's an interesting and rich literature that has shown that documented the link between migration's productivity and the region of origin. And here we are going to provide new evidence of this influence and embed this mechanism into a general equilibrium model to study this effect. Okay, so let me give a bit of the context of this episode. So the migration to the West started in the 40s and 50s when the government at the time was concerned about rapid urbanization along the east coast of Brazil and launched a campaign to occupy the West. And then there is this interesting quote here. In the beginning, the campaign was based on changing Brazilians' perception about leaving the West. So there was the true sense of Brazilianness is the march to the West. But it was not really until the 60s and 70s that this movement really took off with the government, Kubitschek's government who moved the federal capital from Brasilia to from Rio de Janeiro to Brasilia and created several new roads to connect Brasilia. And also with the military government that created the Embrapa to increase productivity in the agricultural sector of the region, and also expanded and created new roads to further integrate the North. So all of those things are happening in the background, as Rafael was mentioning here. So when we look at this phenomenon is very clear when we look across regions here at the data. So here is what we are going to consider as the west of Brazil in red. This is the combines two official regions in Brazil, the central west and the north of the country. And we see in the darker colors the concentration of the population in a given region. And we see that in the 1950, most of the population was concentrated in the east. But when we go to 2010, the population is much more homogeneously distributed across regions. And when we look at the share of the population, it becomes very clear. So between 1870 and 1940, the population in the West was gravitating between 5 and 7%. There is a little bump here related to the rubber cycle. And then after 1940 and 1950, there is this massive expansion of the population in the West from 7 to 15%, which is still ongoing. And those transformations, they are also going to be we also captured by the increase in land and also value added in this region. Okay, and so finally, I'm quickly here. There has been many papers showing that emphasizing the importance of migrant knowledge for the expansion of particular activities. It's mostly qualitative work, but it's very interesting work. For example, for soybean, the work mentions the role that gauchos from the south of Brazil had for the expansion of soybean in the West. Also, coffee has been cited in many papers, the production of coffee in Rondônia, and how coffee producers in Minas Gerais and Espírito Santo went to this particular region. And this is consistent with so many papers looking at these types of relationships in the US, and also some paper from Basi in Indonesia. Okay, good. So to study this episode, we are gonna put a data set with 11 agricultural activities, manufacturing services, 133 mesoregions in 26 states, and 3 periods. We have data from 1950, 1980, 2010. So this is important because we're gonna calibrate the model for each period and recover the productivities, the trade costs, and migration costs for each one of those periods. The demographic census of Brazil will be a particular important piece of data because it has information both on employment in terms of income and activity, quite disaggregated by the crops that those workers are producing. And also together with this, the information of the region where they are coming from in terms of the mesoregion and where they're living. And then we have also demographic census aggregate since the 50s. Part of this data, we had to digitize it. It's the interstate migration in terms of state of birth and state of residence, the employment by activity. And then we are also combining municipality level data in terms of value added, state-to-state trade data, and then international trade data since the 50s. And this is a bit more standard in the literature.
Ito, very quick question here. Are you using information on the region where the person was 5 years before, or using the region of birth to measure? To look at migration flows, right?
Yeah. So we are using. When we take the model to the data, we are going to use the state of birth of the workers. So whether he lived So if he's in Mato Grosso and he says that he was born in Rio Grande do Sul, for example. Okay, so the first pattern here that we are showing is that when we look at this index of revealed comparative advantage, and here in the bottom you see this is revealed bilateral exports, is one of the measures of comparative advantage, and it's basically capturing how much Brazil exporting to the rest of the world F of a crop K, activity K relative to K prime, when we compare how much the rest of the world is exporting to itself of that crop. So if this is above 1, it means it indicates a comparative advantage in that activity. And what we see is that since 1950 to 2010, there was this substantial increase in the revealed comparative advantage as captured by this index for corn, cattle, and soybean. And then when we look at the second part of this table in the East and the West, when we have data on exports by region, we see that the West has a substantial comparative advantage in those activities. And those activities nowadays, when we look at the final part of this table, they account for 40% of the exports to Brazil. So they are important. Brazil was expanding their exports in those 3 activities, and they account for 40% of agricultural exports in Brazil nowadays. When we look at more traditional crops such as coffee, cacao, and banana, their revealed bilateral exports the relative bilateral exports have been decreasing over time. Okay, so this is the main message of this fact that there has been those changes in comparative, in sport specialization, and there is the suggestive evidence that is related to the expansion of the West. When we look across crops, within the West for 2010 and 1980, we see that there is very large differences in terms of the importance of migrants for those different activities. So for example, for soybean, cacao, coffee, this is the share of the workers who are coming from the West itself. So how much of the workers there, the production does not depend on the migration. So in here, those activities, we see that the role of migrants is very large, whereas when you look in tobacco, banana, rest of agriculture, the role of migrants is much smaller. So this already indicates that the role of migrants will be more important for those crops in the left of the figure than for the crops in the right, at least for the West. So for the transformation that we see in the West. And finally, we are gonna ask whether a worker's productivity in a given activity is associated with the, let's say, the dominance of the activity in the region where they come from. So basically, what we are going to do here is compare two groups of farmers who are producing the same activity in the same destination, but who come from regions with different degrees of specialization in activity. So let's say you take 2 farmers producing soybean in the city of Sinop, in the Mato Grosso. One comes from the south, but the other one comes from a region that is not specialized in soybean. And we ask whether this farmer who comes from the south has a systematically higher income when they are producing soybean. So we are going to do this using this reduced form elasticity, just the log of income against the number of workers who are producing that same activity in this previous period, which captures the dominance of this activity. We take the destination activity fixed effect, the bilateral fixed effect, also IJ fixed effect, and the alpha here will be later interpreted by the model as an income elasticity of a worker with respect to the number of workers in the region where they come from. And then the second equation here, I'm gonna go quickly over this here, but it's just capturing how much those changes in income, they translate into changes in choices. So if they have more comparative advantage in a given activity, they have higher income, so a larger proportion of the workers from that region are gonna choose that same activity in the destination. So this table here shows the results from those regressions. We see what, there are many specifications here. In the paper, we explain what we are doing. When we go from the left to the right-hand side of this table, we are introducing different techniques to deal with the problem of statistical zeros that we typically have in those types of data sets. So, for example, we are using PPML, which is a typical also technique, and we are also dealing with some looking at the distribution of workers in the origin. So what you can see is that as we deal with this problem of zero, which tends to be associated with attenuation bias, the coefficients tend to increase as we go to the right-hand side of this table. Okay, and in the paper, we show that those results are largely robust to the socioeconomic controls, to the age structure of the workers in each bin, to the geographic unit that we use, mesoregion, microregion, different lags, individual data. It is very robust. Many different angles are gonna show those results. And then we have some additional results showing that yields are related to the labor supply composition. Okay, so I'm gonna go here, do a bit of heroic work, but I'm gonna try to explain quickly the model and how we take this model to the data. So it's, in terms of the model will be dynamic in the sense that we have a time that is discrete. We have a discrete number of periods. We have multiple regions within the country, one to I and one representative region from for the rest of the world. We have the K activities that I already mentioned, manufacturing services. And here we are just going to assume the simple model of trade that is consistent with gravity equations, in which is just the Armington structure to the model, in which every region is going to produce a different variety of a good that consumers want to buy. And so in this setting, the comparative advantage that we are focusing on is only going to be between activities. Then trade costs are going to deter the flow of goods. Migration costs are going to deter the flow of migrants. Okay, so every region will have a natural advantage to produce a different activity. And I can see this is indexed by T, so this can change over time. Later, we are going to bring land in a more sophisticated way also, but here we are just going to assume that land is exogenously given. And there will be an endogenous labor supply in each region, since workers are choosing where they want to go. The technology is going to be, workers will use their knowledge to produce a good with a coefficient alpha, and they also use intermediate inputs to produce quantity. And then there is this multiple levels for the goods being produced here in this economy. You have the traded goods, which are the activities, and then in each region, there is an aggregator that goes until the final consumption. So the goods across regions, they are combined according to this Armington aggregator. And then at the upper level, they're gonna be aggregated according to a Cobb-Douglas. But this is just a simplified version of the model that we are presenting here, just to give a sense of what we are doing. Okay, so in terms of the overlap demography of the side of the model, there will be an overlapping generation with 2 periods. We are following a recent paper from Treb Allen and Dave Donaldson. And here, different from their paper, workers are going to be heterogeneous in terms of their productivity. They're going to acquire a good specific knowledge, SIKT, and we are going to impose a specific functional form that is going to make the model consistent, directly consistent with the fact 3 that we presented. We are going to assume that this is a power function of the number of workers in the previous period. So it's you can interpret this as an externality. Being around more people producing that activity, you're going to be more productive in that activity. Then when workers are old, they are going to choose where they want to live, which is captured by this maximization problem. They are going to choose where they want to live, what activity to produce, and they are going to consider the wage in the destination, which is given by JK, how this wage is going to interact with their own knowledge S. So there is going to be a sorting between people S that is going to be captured by this complementarity between S and wage. And then they are also going to consider the migration cost. And then there is this idiosyncratic shock that is the epsilon. And here is basically a discrete type choice model in which there is a continuum of workers in a given origin. And then some of those workers are going to choose different destinations and activities based on their unobserved preferences for working those activities. Okay, and then in the end of the period, they have a child, and we move on to the next period. Okay, with this structure, so workers are choosing where they want to buy their goods from. They're choosing where they want to live. And this is going to give two sets of equations that control the general equilibrium in each period of the model. The first set of equations, this is a more standard, thanks, John, a more standard type of equation. It's basically the share of goods that region J are buying from I for activity K. And those, I'm not going to go through the details of this here, but one of the important expression here that we are going to also take to the data is the one below. The migration flows will also have this sort of structure in which we have the big W is the systematic component of welfare of workers who go from I to J to produce activity K in period T. And the Xi here is the welfare of those workers coming from this region I. And okay, and then the equilibrium, there is a sequence of prices that clear labor markets given the effective labor that you have in each region. And then the migration flows, they have to maximize utility. We don't have much to add here. Okay, I'm gonna show you, there are a couple of results that we show how our model relates to the relative bilateral export that I presented earlier, but I'm not gonna go through all the details of this. But one of the important results is this one. So what is this result showing? When we look at the model, the changes in the relative bilateral export, they can be captured by this expression here. So what do you have in the right-hand side? So this is the fact of going from a situation in which there are limited migration costs between regions to a context in which there is infinite migration between regions. So you're forbidding any sort of migration to a given region. So what you see in the right-hand side is the exposure of that region from migrants, from workers from its own region. So epsilon IIK is the exposure of of the region to workers from the region itself, and the epsilon IIK prime is also for another activity. And when you have this, when the right-hand side here is smaller than 0, it means that the drop in the relative bilateral export is going to be larger, since that activity is more exposed to migrants from other regions. Okay, so I have just a couple of minutes here. So let me, how much time do I have? Like 2 minutes, right?
3 minutes, right? 3 minutes.
3 minutes, okay. So, okay, so let me give just a big picture. I already explained a bit of this, but we are going to match the model for 1950, 1980, 2010. We are going to recover the productivities, trade costs, and migration costs that are consistent with the evolution of the economy during this period. So we are going to account for the possibility, for example, that productivities are increasing because of Embrapa, that trade costs are dropping because of trade liberalization. But we're also going to incorporate the changes in migration costs that are consistent with migration flows in the data. And then we are going to drop those migration costs and look at the effect on exports. So, and this is the results. I'm going to stop here in this figure on the west and the left-hand side, the Western regions. On the x-axis, you have that sufficient statistic that I presented earlier. And this is the exposure of a given region in the West to migrants. This index of exposure in terms of relative to manufacturing. And when you go to the left of this, it means that the region is more exposed to migrants. So what happens is that in their counterfactor, there's a larger drop in the relative exports of those activities. So this is basically tracing the relationship that that our sufficient statistic predicted earlier on. And okay, so I have a couple of results here, but let me just finish here by saying that those changes in migration costs contributed to Brazil emerge as a global exporter of soy. The workers' knowledge, they played an important role in these transformations when we do the composition of the model. And those results, they highlight the importance of those complementarities in policies. There has been those investments from Embrapa in terms of enabling the production of different crops in the West. But those roads and land distribution projects, they facilitated the migration to the West, and they operated as an important complement to those other investments in productivity. And yeah, so I guess that this is all I had to say. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Heitor. Great presentation. I think, I mean, since we're like short on time, I think if someone has like major questions, you can discuss directly with Heitor after the session, okay?
Yeah.
So now let's move to Rafael. He's going to present a paper about trading balances.
Hi, okay, yeah, thank you, João. Oops, no, bad move. All right, slides are up. Everyone see? Yep. Okay. Well, thank you very much, João, for the invitation. Happy to be here. I'm going to be presenting work with joint with João, as well as Ricardo Reyes-Heroles and Sharon Traberman at NYU. All right, so the motivation for the work is that there's a lot of evidence at this point that globalization shocks, such as the rise of China or trade liberalization episodes, lead to important disruptions in the labor market. Okay, so they lead to changes in the composition of sectors, they lead to people going to spells of unemployment, informality, and so on and so forth. So in response to this reduced form literature, there has been increasing interest in modeling and quantifying the labor market adjustment process in response to these globalization shocks. Okay, so there's a lot of interest in measuring and understanding mobility frictions and thinking about the implications of these frictions for the adjustment process. Okay, and along the adjustment process, we may be very concerned with the distribution effects of globalization shocks, as well as smoothing policies that the government could be thinking about implementing to compensate the winners from the losers from trade. At the same time, what we see, at least in the US, we see very persistent and growing trade deficits, and we actually see many policy actors in the US blaming not only globalization, but specifically persistent trade deficits, okay, for their labor market problems. And indeed, trade deficits have for decades and across the political spectrum occupied a very central role in policymakers' concerns with globalization. Okay, so this is widespread view that, I mean, that trade deficits actually define winners and losers. So if you're running a trade deficit, you're being exploited by the system. And if you're running a trade surplus, you're actually winning the system, okay? And this view is because there's this belief that trade deficits crowds out domestic production and jobs in manufacturing, which we're seeing as the good jobs in the economy. So perhaps in a disconnect with current policy concerns, trade economists have completely ignored changes in imbalances when they study the labor market adjustment process. Okay, and this paper is going to be asking the question whether, does it matter? Does it matter that this literature studying the labor market adjustment process to globalization completely ignores trading balances? And how much do we lose by doing so? And at least from an intuitive perspective, it should matter. Think about the textbook model in trade. The textbook model in trade typically imposes balanced trade. What that means is that if you have a surge in imports into your country, you also need to have a surge of exports. So you have the synchronization between declining sectors and expanding sectors. Okay? Whereas if you don't impose balanced trade, you don't need to have the synchronization. You can have large increases in imports without having large increases in exports. And so the synchronization breaks. And this paper is about, okay, so quantitatively, how does that impact the adjustment process in response to these import surge shocks? So to address these questions, we're going to be developing a framework to understanding the role of trading balances in the labor market adjustment process in response to globalization shocks. And this is going to be a framework where we're going to be endogenizing trading balances in a model of trade with both unemployment and costly labor market adjustment. Now, more specifically, we're going to be building an estimable general equilibrium multi-country, multi-sector model with 3 key ingredients. So the first key ingredient here is we're going to have the side of the model generating imbalances, and imbalances are generated through a representative family making consumption and savings decisions. So we're going to have this family making decisions on intertemporal trade. They're going to be trading consumption across time. Okay, and we're going to have a model with labor market frictions, both across sectors as well as within sectors, and that is going to be generating rich unemployment dynamics in the model. And then this is a model of trade, so we're going to be bringing all of the framework that has been built in this past 15 years or so. So this is going to be a model of recurring comparative advantage and costly trade. So I'm going to be very quick here on where this paper lives in the literature. We have models with trading balances, okay, but with perfect labor mobility, so no adjustment frictions on the labor side. We have models of trade with no imbalances and no mobility frictions. We have models with mobility frictions, but without modeling imbalances, at least seriously, okay? And we have this paper, which is going to be thinking about both things at the same time. Now, also relative to Caliendo-Dworkin and Paro, not only we're going to have imbalances, but we're also going to have unemployment, which is something that Caliendo-Dworkin and Paro do not have. What they do have in this model is a labor supply decision. So every move to non-employment is voluntary. And in our model, we're going to have involuntary unemployment into this framework. Okay, so this is going to be about putting 3 or 4 big frameworks consistent with each other. Okay, so we're going to be building on existing workhorse models of trading balances and labor market adjustment. On the imbalances side, we're going to be building on Upsalt and Rogoff by having representative families making intertemporal consumption decisions leading to trading balances. On the trade side, we're going to be building on the very popular and widely used Eaton Corton model extended by Carrera and Paro to allow for intermediate inputs, okay, and intersector linkages. And we're going to be modeling labor market frictions across sectors based on Arthur Chern and McLaren, and within sectors based on Mortensen and Pissarides. And what we're going to be doing here, hopefully in the next few minutes, is to give you some idea of how do we fit these three frameworks together. So the first part is thinking about this family making intertemporal consumption decisions. So you can think about a representative family, a representative household in a given country, okay, maximizing the net present value of utility of each of its, aggregating across the members of the family. Okay, so the members of the family are denoted by L. Okay, so the family cares about all of the individuals in the family, and the family discounts the future based on these two terms here. This is going to be an exogenous and constant discount factor, and this phi term here is going to be these are going to be shocks to intertemporal preferences. Okay, they're going to be country specific. Okay, now when we think about the utility of an individual, we're going to have two things here. We're going to have the utility of consumption, but you're also going to have many other terms that dictate labor supply across sectors. So the C is going to be mobility frictions, mobility costs across sectors. The B is going to be the disutility of unemployment, for instance. Okay. Now, as the family makes this decision, okay, as the family maximizes the net present value of utility, the family is going to be respecting this intertemporal budget constraint, okay, where it is going to be amassing or accumulating income from the economy, from the agents. These are total wages in the economy. These are total profits. And these B terms here are going to be international bonds through which countries can actually lend or borrow to itself, to each other. Okay, so the intertemporal connection is going to precisely come through the accumulation of these bonds. Now this is going to be, so just as a preview, we're going to be using the Lagrange multiplier on that restriction, and we're going to be calling the Lagrange multiplier as lambda tilde. Okay, so the Lagrange multiplier, think about it as if the family gets a little bit richer, okay, how does that impact the maximized value of utility? Now this model is going to be dictating that the family is going to be equalizing consumption across individuals. So this is going to be a model of full risk sharing within countries. So we're not going to be able to talk about inequality effects of globalization shocks in this model, okay? But the setup is going to allow us to actually decentralize labor market decisions to the individual worker level, greatly simplifying our problem. Okay, so as we solve this family problem, we're going to be deriving a Euler equation, and the Euler equation is going to be dictating how families trade off future consumption, okay, with respect to current consumption. Okay, and we're going to be working with log utility of consumption. So the only thing you have to get for now is that the consumption, the utility of consumption is concave. Now, this is going to be very dense and complicated, but I just want to give you an idea of some of the key elements of the model. And it's going to be, I'm just trying to informally go through how we can decentralize this household problem into individual workers' problems. Okay? And here we're thinking about the decision problem of unemployed workers. So think about an unemployed worker searching, so that worker is initially employed. That worker is initially unemployed in sector K, and that worker needs to decide in what sector that worker is going to be searching to work in the next period. So if the worker wants to switch sectors, the worker needs to incur a cost of switching. There's going to be a idiosyncratic shock, an idiosyncratic preference shock for sectors. The reason why you have these here is to smooth the labor supply decision, okay? To have a continuous labor and well-behaved labor supply decision across sectors. Workers get unemployment benefits according to the sector they choose. And then there's going to be a given probability that the worker finds a match with a firm. If the worker finds a match with the firm, the worker is going to be bargaining with the firm for the wages. Okay, so this is going to be reflected in this term. And if the worker does not get a match, the worker is going to be back unemployed into the destination sector it chose. Now, if a worker is currently employed, then the value of employment with a firm with productivity X is given by the wage, but this is critical here. The wage is going to be weighted by this Lagrange multiplier, okay, on the family's problem, okay? And this is going to be an important object of our model. This is what allows us to decentralize this problem to the worker level. But other than this, the worker cares about the wage weighted by the Lagrange multiplier. It cares about it cares about compensating differentials across sectors. And then there's a probability that the match is going to be broken, which is given by chi. If the match is not broken, the worker keeps with the match. If the match is broken, the worker goes to unemployment. Now, just trying to give an idea here of the key elements of the model. Of course, it's a bit too quick for it to be completely useful. But anyway, if we think about
Rafael. Hello?
Daqui a pouco volta, tá acontecendo direto isso.
Boa, Rafael.
Okay. Sorry. Are you guys there?
Sim.
Yes.
Okay. So, all right. So I was talking about the firm's problem. So here you're going to have so sectors are going to be populated by a given continuum of varieties. Okay, indexed by J. Okay, and this is very similar. And let me just say here out front that the setup is very similar to Caliendo and Paro. Okay, but with the difference here is that each variety, the production of each variety is going to be populated by single worker firms. So that's one first difference. The other difference is that once a firm posts a vacancy to hire a worker, that firm worker match is going to have a
Well, did he freeze again for you guys? Yes. Hello?
back. Tá de novo. Vamos lá.
Sorry for that, Rafael.
Okay. So so where was I? Okay. So once a firm meets with a worker, that match is going to be drawing a idiosyncratic match given by this X term. Now, if you're familiar with the models of trade at Kalyan-Paro, this production function looks exactly the same as a Kalyan-Paro production function. Okay, so we're going to have here a variety-specific productivity. Okay, now this is the idiosyncratic productivity of the match, and these are determined inputs that are going to be coming into production. Now, this is the problem that the firm is going to be solving for how much of each intermediate input bundle it is going to be producing. And the key assumption that I have to impose here is that a firm can constantly switch across varieties J within the sector. If that's the case, then we can actually write the surplus of the firm, which is the revenue of the firm before, which is the profit of the firm before paying wages. You can actually write down that surplus as a linear function of the match, okay? Where this W tilde is going to be an endogenous variable that we have to determine. But that is going to simplify our life because prices for varieties can be written as a ratio of the cost of the unit input bundle divided by the productivity of that variety. Okay, and from here we can very easily just apply the Eden Quartum and Kalyan-Paro tools. Now, so the critical thing here, and this is what I said, I was trying to make the case of how to put things together. This is going to be a model where different firms are going to be paying different wages to workers, okay? And the assumption that firms can cautiously switch across varieties is the key assumption that is going to allow us to make this difficult problem in light of the Eden Quartum model tractable, because we can actually write prices of each variety in an Eden Quartum way.
Well, can I ask a quick question? So is the model going to satisfy the conditions for the ACR results?
It's not. So we're going to be violating ACR for two reasons. We're going to be trading balances, which is something that they don't allow for, and we're going to have labor market frictions. So that's actually one of the exercises in the paper that we conduct is how far off ACR is going to be from our welfare predictions. Okay, so I'm not going to get too much into detail here. I only have 6 minutes, so I want to get some leeway here to talk about the key mechanisms of the model. But let me just say that we estimate this model. We estimate this model using data from the World Input-Output Database, ILO stat to get unemployment rates across countries. And we also use the USCPS to get information on transition rates across sectors within the United States. Okay. Now, let me focus here on the key forces of the model. Let me just anticipate that we're going to be conducting a series of empirical exercises. We do that in the paper. But since we're not going to have, I'm not going to have time to go through all that here. Let me just say, if you're interested in the paper, you can look at these empirical exercises in the paper. Here, I'm going to be focusing on a series of impulse response functions just to get some intuition of what's happening in this model. Okay, so by doing so, we're going to do the following. We're going to think about different shocks to the evolution of productivity in China. And we're going to be thinking about three sorts of shocks. One is going to be a temporary shock, where China gets very rich for a given amount of time, but then it gets poor right afterwards. So that's going to be the temporary shock. Then we're going to be thinking about permanent shocks. We're going to be thinking about one-time permanent shock. Think about a discrete increase in Chinese productivity that persists forever versus a slow-moving increase in Chinese productivity. And we're going to be thinking about the implications of the model for adjustment under these three scenarios. Okay, so let's think about the temporary shock first. So China gets very rich for 5 years, gets very productive for 5 years, but then it goes back to its normal levels of productivity. So in that case, what China wants to do, China wants to smooth consumption over time. So it's going to be very heavily lending, it's going to be saving very heavily in the short run to the rest of the world, so that in the long run, it is able to consume a bit more, okay, and thereby smoothing consumption. So nothing really surprising here. So China saves a lot in the short run, and therefore other countries in the world run large deficits by borrowing China savings. Okay. Now we're getting to more interesting stuff. We're going to be comparing the predictions of our model with trading balances with the predictions of our model with balanced trade, where we exogenously impose that agents cannot smooth consumption or trade intertemporally. So there's no savings or borrowing in this model. So that's what we mean by a balanced trade model. So one thing that strikes here is that if we look at the amount of reallocation that occurs in our model, okay, which is the solid blue line, we have a lot more reallocation than a model with balanced trade, okay? And we also see unemployment responding a lot more than if we had imposed balanced trade. So just here in this figure, you can see that just in this figure, you can see that quantitatively, modeling trading balances can matter a great deal for the adjustment process. Now, let's try to understand a bit more the fact that we have a lot more reallocation with trading balances than without trading balances. So here, we're thinking about, for each country, we're thinking about the evolution of labor allocations in the complete model versus the model where we restrict it to be under trade balance. And what we see here, so again, China is getting very productive in the short run. It is going to be, in the complete model, it is going to be massively saving. And other countries such as the US, Asia, and so on and so forth are going to be borrowing, okay, from China, which means that how is the mechanism happening? China is going to be shipping goods to the US. So what we see here is that all of the goods sectors in the US decline in the short run. Okay, so China is expanding in the goods sectors, shipping stuff to the US. The US is taking that stuff and substituting away labor from the goods sectors into service sectors, right? It's consuming more tradables, and because of homothetic preferences, it needs to be consuming more services, and therefore it shifts resources to services in the short run. Now, in the long run, what happens? The US is going to have to repay China for these goods. And how is the US going to be repaying China for these goods? Well, it's going to have to repay by producing goods. So in the long run, the US moves labor away from services now and into the goods sectors for it to be able to repay China. Now, that's an interesting thing that is happening here, And this is not at all what happens when we have a model where we impose trade balance every period. So if we impose trade balance every period, we see here that the pattern of reallocation is very different, and actually a lot more muted. Right. So in a trade balance model, for the U.S. to be able to import goods from China, it needs to expand here. In this case, it is going to be expanding in agriculture. Now, the other interesting thing that is happening here, why exactly do we see this magnification of reallocation in the model of trading balances? Well, recall that Lagrange multiplier that I emphasized a few slides back. What is happening here is that if you have a model with trade balance, you don't have consumption smoothing over time. So if China becomes very, very rich, okay, what is going to happen is China becomes very rich, so it consumes a lot immediately. So that the marginal value of China reallocating workers across sectors in a concave utility world is very diminished. Okay, so remember that the way we decentralize the household problem into the workers' problem is that now households care about the Lagrange multiplier times wages. Okay, so workers take into account their decisions on the household's utility as a whole. So if we jump consumption, we go into a part of the utility function with very little returns. So when you're going to be making the decision of where to work, wages don't matter much at this point. Okay, so I mean, I know this is a little quick, but that's the key intuition of why we see a lot more relocation in the model of trading balances relative to the model with balance trade. Now, in the model with trading balances, consumption doesn't jump as much in the short run because you smooth consumption over time. Now, the other thing that is interesting in this model is that the model with trading balances lead to very persistent effects on labor allocations, which is an effect that we don't see when you have trade balance. And the reason why this occurs is because over the transition path, countries are going to be accumulating wealth. So in the new steady state, they have levels of wealth that are different from the levels of wealth in the initial steady state. Now, I don't have a lot of time here. So let me just conclude here. I think I already gave the key intuitions behind the model. Okay, so what we find here in this paper is that trading balances are key drivers of the consequences of globalization and labor market outcomes. So for one, imbalances can greatly magnify effects of globalization on intersector reallocation and employment, as well as have effects on relocation paths. So this is one thing that I forgot to emphasize, that if you have a model of trading balances, the full path of shocks matters for where you're going to be landing in the long run. Okay, which is very different from what a model with trade balances would tell you. A model with trade balances would tell you that the full path of shocks does not matter. But in a model with trading balances, it does. Okay, and then I didn't cover it here, but we have a series of empirical applications in the paper where we recover shocks that the economy has actually experienced, the global economy has actually experienced between 2000 and 2014. And we conduct a series of experiments thinking about, for instance, the China shock in the context of our model, as well as Heitor mentioned, we think about the implications of our model for us to be thinking about welfare, and how do we compare these welfare consequences with standard tools in the literature. That was a little too quick, and I apologize if it was unclear, but I hope I at least gave a bit of a taste for the paper. Thank you, guys.
Well, thank you very much, Rafael. Great presentation as well. I think this ends the session, and feel free to stay and talk a bit more about the stuff here. Thanks very much again, guys. Opa. Ok. Cara, é difícil apresentar paper estrutural em 30 minutos, né, cara?
Mas o Rafael fez um bom trabalho.
Vocês foram bem, cara. Vocês foram bem. Foi pegar, assim.
Pô, valeu.
Parabéns aí para todos.
Valeu, cara.
Valeu.
Eu ia
Tchau.
uma coisa, o paper de vocês, João, Rafael, então, assim, muita gente fala assim do trading balance e como teria menos unemployment se não tivesse trading balance. Aí eu fiquei pensando muito no welfare, consequência. Aqui, acho que o primeiro passo é entender quais são os efeitos em employment primeiro, né? Aí depois, por isso estava perguntando das consequências para o welfare. Mas foi meio rápido, mas tem consequências para a desigualdade, pelo menos, assim, porque você tem heterogeneidade de trabalhadores em diferentes setores, então, pelo menos no curto prazo, tem algumas medidas de welfare que vai ser diferente, imagina, para diferentes trabalhadores.
Sim e não. A primeira resposta é não em termos de consumo por conta do problema que a gente, da forma com que a gente escreveu o problema, né? Que você tem esse problema da família e a família vai equalizar consumo entre agentes. Então a gente não é um modelo de o modelo não vai conseguir falar sobre desigualdade em consumo. Agora, o modelo vai conseguir falar sobre desigualdade em renda. Sim, a gente pode falar isso. A gente não está enfatizando isso nesse artigo, mas sim, a gente pode. A gente tem efeitos substanciais em renda. Mas a gente não enfatiza isso porque, né, não seria kosher dado o arcabouço. Agora, desemprego vai ter um efeito, né? Porque desemprego responde de forma bastante forte em alguns cenários. Em outros cenários, não. Por exemplo, uma das conclusões que a gente tem aqui é que o choque da China não teve efeito grande em desemprego nos Estados Unidos. Mas o choque da China teve um efeito grande em desemprego na China. Porque a China teve que realocar muito seus trabalhadores entre setores. E, aparentemente, quando o Sharon apresentou em outro seminário, alguém falou que realmente existe alguma evidência de que o desemprego da China aumentou durante os anos 2000. Mas respondi a sua pergunta?
Não, respondeu. É isso mesmo. Eu acho que a questão da renda e consumo era isso que estava... Quando eu vi o modelo, eu estava pensando... Tem alguma desigualdade? Tem, mas o consumo é equalizado, mas você ainda tem a renda que está acontecendo no background assim, do modelo.
Isso. E outra coisa que para pensar também é que no futuro a gente pode pensar em desigualdade. A gente pode pensar em um modelo onde você tem duas famílias, talvez. Uma família skilled, outra família unskilled, e aí... Aí a gente consegue falar um pouco mais sobre desigualdade entre grupos nesse caso.
Porque agora o trade deficit, ele no final é welfare improving, né? O trade deficit. Porque senão...
Exatamente. A gente tem esse resultado também que a gente olha para os... eu acho que não é, se eu me lembro corretamente, não é uniforme. Mas se você tiver... Deixa eu lembrar aqui qual era o resultado. A gente tem um cálculo sobre os ganhos de globalização entre 2000 e 2014, e eu acho que o resultado é que os Estados Unidos ganham 2,3%, né? Entre 2000 e 2014. Se a gente não tivesse tido o China Savings Glut, que é uma coisa que eu não enfatizei aqui, mas o Savings Glut é modelado por aqueles choques em preferências intertemporais. Se a gente não tivesse tido um Chinese Glut, os Estados Unidos ia beneficiar um pouco mais ia beneficiar 73%, os ganhos de globalização seriam 73% maiores. Mas se os Estados Unidos vivessem num mundo em trade balance, os ganhos seriam 50% menores.
Ah, tá.
Mas isso não é homogêneo. Não é homogêneo,
tem-
não é... Deixa eu ver aqui.
Mas tem outros países que têm situação diferente, né, cara?
Imagino que depende, por exemplo, o Brasil vai ter um trade, vai ter um superávit com a China. Então, no Brasil vai ser o efeito um pouco diferente.
Por exemplo, aqui a Ásia tem um ganho muito pequeno de globalização no modelo completo, mas tem um ganho maior se a gente impuser balance trade.
É verdade.
Então não é sempre na mesma direção. Se você balance trade. Agora, o que a gente pode
mas isso é por causa do efeito de equilíbrio geral? Porque a minha impressão é que você sempre está aumentando a opção. É só porque os Estados Unidos agora vai realocar tanto que talvez isso gere algum problema no terms of trade desses países da Ásia.
Eu acho que o que a gente está fazendo não é exatamente o que você quer. Eu acho que a gente pode fazer isso, o que você quer. Mas o que a gente está fazendo aqui é que a gente está shutting down the bonds market. A gente está shutting down para todo mundo. Eu acho que o que você quer talvez, ok, o que acontece só os Estados Unidos?
Entendi.
Shut down bonds market. É isso que você está querendo
dizer. É isso, exato. Porque
isso a gente não respondeu.
Porque isso sempre vai ser meio self-improving, a minha impressão. Mas aí quando você shut down todo mundo, aí tem os efeitos de equilíbrio geral, porque a China vai ganhar muito espaço em cima de outros países e tal. Com superávit. Não, legal.
Eu acho que tem um spin-off desse paper onde a gente pode começar a modelar tarifas, né? Aí você pode pensar em se o Trump quiser reduzir o trade deficit aumentando um pouco as tarifas, né? Aí o que acontece? E aí o limite podia ser, de repente, no trade deficit.
No trade
deficit. Não, legal. Não, uma pergunta bem, talvez muito de grid, sabe, nos guts do modelo, mas tem essa discussão desses modelos Pissarides. Eu não sou dessa literatura, mas que eles têm a transição é muito rápida nesses modelos. E vocês vão ter isso também?
A gente tem mais fricção do que no modelo deles, né? E talvez o que esteja gerando mais, né, quer dizer, o sluggish adjustment aí, seja as fricções de mobilidade entre setores. Mas a gente, cara, realmente a gente não rodou o modelo só com uma fricção, só com outra, para ver qual a diferença da velocidade de transição.
Mas tem aqui, né? Por exemplo, tem uma simulação aqui. Cara, é rápido. Eu realmente não sei o que é rápido aqui, mas eu estou vendo aqui uma das figuras aqui. A dinâmica de desemprego na Ásia, por exemplo, no choque temporário, a dinâmica se completa em 10 anos. Não acho que seja absurdamente rápido isso.
Não.
Na verdade, é um bom timing, cara. Né? Tipo, sei lá, né? Se você imaginar se fosse 150 anos, você começava a suspeitar que tinha alguma coisa.
Exatamente.
Se fosse 2,
se fosse 2, é a mesma coisa. 10 parece uma coisa justa.
Mas uma coisa interessante aqui é justamente isso. É que se você bota trade bounds, o desemprego quase não é afetado. Quase não é afetado. E, em parte, o desemprego quase não é afetado porque você não tem tanta realocação.
Não, isso é interessante mesmo, porque é um lado, assim, pensando, um modelo só um modelo Hash-Carolyn com unemployment não vai reproduzir bem o desemprego nos Estados Unidos, o efeito de trading de desemprego. Então, não, isso é interessante mesmo.
O nosso modelo, assim, sempre, quer dizer, né, o cara que está procurando emprego é o desempregado, né? Então, assim, sempre que tiver realocação grande, né, tem desemprego acontecendo junto.
Isso é verdade, João, mas tem uma coisa também que a gente estima o modelo no período, a gente estima e a gente simula o modelo no quarterly period, e a gente só plota aqui
o ano, né? Certo. Perfeito.
Então acho que um pouco disso aí
tá suavizado, né? Porque
vai ter
um pico no primeiro quarto, né? Porque os caras... Mas aí suaviza ao longo do ano. Boa.
Isso.
Não, legal.
Pessoal, obrigado. Eu tenho um comentário aqui para o artigo de vocês dois.
Valeu.
Deixa eu começar com o Heitor, porque eu tenho menos contato.
Beleza.
Heitor, muito interessante. Achei muito interessante mesmo. Mas eu tive algumas coisas aqui que eu fiquei pensando ao longo do tempo, o curso da sua apresentação, é que o March to the West, né, é um march towards agriculture, mas é um march towards agriculture que é labor saving. Então, no sentido que eu comecei a pensar, pô, mas você está relocando tanto trabalhador para lá, mas esses trabalhadores, maciçamente, não vão estar indo para a agricultura. Eles vão estar indo para atividades que provavelmente apoiam a agricultura, serviços ou algo do tipo. E eu estava esperando ver o teu modelo, porque realmente estava esperando ver esses intersectoral linkages, né, entre agricultura e serviços. E, em particular, eu estava tentando também, eu estava esperando ver algo como, ok, a agricultura no oeste do Brasil é labor saving, é muito mecanizada. E, nesse sentido, eu fiquei um pouco puzzled quando você começou a falar sobre renda do fazendeiro e relacionando a renda do fazendeiro a renda média do fazendeiro, de onde ele estava vindo, ou coisa do tipo, né? Aí eu comecei a pensar, puxa vida, mas no Oeste, isso é uma coisa que eu acho que você tem que esclarecer. Pô, mas no Oeste não tem fazendeiro, no Oeste não tem pequeno produtor, é tudo grande, né? É agricultura extensiva, grandes corporações. Então, acho que seria interessante contextualizar e discutir um pouco, talvez, os ganhos. Aonde que você está fazendo hipóteses fortes aqui?
Não, isso é bom. Não, esses comentários são bons porque eles estão em linha com alguns comentários que a gente está recebendo em outros lugares. Eu tenho que pensar, o comentário sobre labor saving é bem interessante, porque realmente a gente tem, quando a gente tem alguns exercícios que a gente faz a simulação do modelo com e sem heterogeneidade na land intensity entre crops. Então, por exemplo, soja e o gado vai ser bem mais labor saving, não usam tanto trabalhador quanto produção de café, por exemplo. E aí o que acontece é que os efeitos tendem a ser bem menores, porque o que acontece é que sem os trabalhadores do leste, você vai ter um surplus de terra na região que acaba abafando um pouco os efeitos que você tem vai baixar o preço da terra e vai atenuar um pouco o fato de você não ter trabalhador naquela região. Então, a gente tem que trabalhar um pouco mais isso, até porque essa história vem de labor saving, tem alguns artigos falando disso e tal.
Só uma dúvida relacionada a esse ponto, Rafael, Heitor. Tipo, em 80, é labor saving também, cara? Essas migrações, assim? Será que tem mecanização aí nessas lavouras?
Não, então, esse é outro ponto, assim. Tem
tipo, em 2010,
produção de larga escala.
Mas não sei, depois o cara já está lá.
Tem grandes corporações, tal, e nos anos 80 ainda não tinha essas grandes tradings, elas não estavam lá, tipo a Bunge, DCB, não sei o quê, a Cargill, mas então isso foi um pouco mais recente, mas é uma coisa de grande produção mesmo. Então, mas é muito, ainda assim, tem que contextualizar melhor mesmo. Eu fui lá, entrevistei faz alguns anos, fui lá, ajudei um pessoal num projeto de sociologia lá, entrevistei uns 150 fazendeiros fazendo meses, né? E eles são grandes, mas eles não são tão grandes assim, é tipo 100 hectares, então tem uma famíliazinha de 3 pessoas lá, e vários fazendeiros pequenos. Então, por exemplo, você vai em Sinop, vai ter um sindicato lá de 150 fazendeiros produzindo soja.
Cooperativas, né?
Cooperativas. E aí, quando você pega gado, aí vai ser bem menorzinho. Então, soja é concentrada em alguns lugares e tal, mas aí se você pega gado, não é tão grande, tem muita produção pequena lá também. Você vai indo principalmente para o lado de Rondônia, mais para o norte do Mato Grosso. Então, tinha um pouco isso, porque eu acho que tem a gente tem que contextualizar melhor, acho, porque dá a impressão de que alguns fazendeiros managers estão dominando a região, tipo Mage, não sei o quê, e que é verdade, tem uns desses, mas não tem mais nada na região. Mas tem bastante desses outros. Então, o que a gente está fazendo, pensando numa sessão que a gente É difícil sempre colocar um parágrafo de uma forma ponderada, assim, mas não se estender muito, sabe? Fazer um próprio artigo sobre isso, mas
Lógico.
pelo menos descrever um pouco como é que é a agricultura na região, assim, alguns dados, assim, tamanho de fazenda, média, um pouco a distribuição.
E me diz uma coisa aqui, Heitor, e voltando àquela pergunta que eu fiz há uma hora, eu acho que, se eu entendo bem o que você está fazendo, você está escrevendo um sistema meio tipo Steve Redding, né, onde você back out esses os custos de mobilidade mais como resíduo, né, para você match. E isso você faz o quê? Você faz com determinado período? Como é que é? Ou isso você faz? Ou você vê esses custos de mobilidade diminuindo ao longo do tempo porque você estima essa?
Isso. Então, o que a gente faz é estimar o custo de mobilidade entre estados. Então, você tem o modelo, na parte de migração, ela vai ser, digamos, state level. E aí a gente tem migração, dado de migração, de cada origem, cada destino. Então, você consegue ter uma regressão, digamos, para cada período, em termos de origem e destino, que é uma gravity equation. E aí você consegue usar um head and his index para a migração, para extrair o custo de migração implícito naqueles fluxos de...
Ok, mas para head and his você precisa da elasticidade de migração, né? Como é que vocês fazem isso?
Isso. Isso. A gente está estimando isso. Naquela primeira tabela que a gente mostrou, que eu mostrei, eu não tive tempo de mostrar isso, mas a primeira row daquela tabela tem o efeito de número de trabalhadores no income. E aí, a segunda linha é o efeito de número de trabalhador, digamos, externalidade, nas ocupações. E aí, esses dois coeficientes juntos, eles vão te dar o kappa, digamos, a elasticidade de migração, que aí você consegue colocar lá para estimar o head and his index. E aí, assim, o que a gente achou, a gente poderia calibrar isso de acordo com a literatura também, falar, essa elasticidade é 2, que é o que muita gente está achando. A gente acha uma coisa um pouco menor, 1.6, 1.7. Então, a gente foi com o valor que a gente tinha mesmo. E aí, ao longo do tempo, você vê uma redução bem clara no custo de migração, usando esse index, esse índice. E também tem algumas coisas, ele é correlacionado com distância, tem algumas coisas.
Agora, vocês também não têm... Agora, uma razão para esse custo estar caindo ao longo do tempo é também que, sei lá, em 1950 não tinha ninguém lá, né? Aí hoje tem muito mais gente, é muito mais agradável você ir para lá. Aí isso não consegue separar, né? Ou consegue?
Isso pega no efeito fixo. No efeito fixo. Desde que não seja origem e destino específico, a gente está capturando no modelo. Então, uma amenidade da região ou produtividade na região, isso vai aumentar o fluxo de trabalhador de todas as outras regiões. Porque todo mundo vai mais para aquela região. Só que...
verdade. Mas eu tenho uma crítica a esse método, porque é o seguinte, pensa no custo de mobilidade, ok? Pensa no custo de mobilidade entre região J e região K. J e K. Suponha que você possa escrever esse custo de mobilidade em 3 peças. Um custo específico à região J, é um custo de saída, um custo que é idiosincrático às duas regiões,
bilateral,
e um custo de entrada. Se você usar efeito fixo de origem e destino, você vai estar capturando esses 2 pedaços, né? Aí você só vai estar sobrando o resíduo, né? Aquela parte que é realmente JK específica.
É isso, mas é verdade.
Mas você está entendendo? Então você estaria, se você usar só essa componente do custo, você pode estar subestimando os custos, né?
Exatamente. Não. Certamente. Esse método, ele parte da assumption que esses custos são, o I e o J são ou produtividades ou são normalizados para 1, porque basicamente você assumir que eles não existem. Então, mas é que nem em trade, né? A gente tem isso. Então, quando está usando o Haddon
De gravidade, né, que você está falando. Tipo,
para gravidade,
custo.
Isso. Então, isso realmente não pega. Mas assim, tem... O que a gente está tentando fazer agora é exatamente validar um pouco mais esses custos de migração, dado que a gente coloca tanta ênfase neles. Então, por exemplo, ver como é que está correlacionado com observáveis, como distância para...
Isso, exatamente. Isso que eu sugeri,
duas regiões, tipos land grants, essas coisas. E não é tão fácil, porque que nem o Rafael está falando, qualquer coisa que é destino ou origem vai meio que soaked up, né, no método. Então, se eu tiver alguma coisa que está aumentando, diminuindo o custo de transporte para todo mundo, de todas as regiões, eu não consigo pegar isso.
Tá.
Agora, isso vai depender muito, isso é uma robustez, isso vai depender muito dos referee reports que vocês forem receber. Mas, pô, você pode fazer. Supõe que você... Ok. No fim das contas, você tem um problema de identificação aí. O que é custo de mobilidade específico à origem, né? Versus, sei lá, produtividade e outras coisas.
Isso.
Você pode fazer... Será que você pode fazer hipóteses extremas aí? Supõe que seja só custo de mobilidade. E aí, quando você for olhar para o... E não produtividade. Quando você for olhar para o seu contrafatual,
pode.
Você elimina todos os custos, inclusive essa componente. Enfim, eu estou interessado. Isso é um comentário que sempre que eu leio esse tipo de trabalho, eu tenho esse comentário na minha cabeça, né? E muitas vezes eu boto no parecer também. Mas uma coisa que eu quero saber ok. Eu acho uma coisa que, se eu escrever isso num parecer para você, você primeiro me responder o seguinte: isso não é sensível, porque eu posso fazer essas hipóteses aqui. E eu posso distribuir esses choques para produtividade versus custo de mobilidade de várias formas, isso não vai influir no meu resultado.
Legal.
Isso. Não, é exatamente isso que eu ia falar. Desde que essas coisas têm efeitos muito isomórficos nesses modelos, né? Então, se você chama isso de produtividade, amenidade, eles acabam tendo efeito muito parecido. Não vai ter se você começar a modular a amenidade, por exemplo, de acordo com o número de trabalhador. Então, tem gente que vai fazer isso. A amenidade depende da quantidade de pessoas, porque se tem mais gente, você vai ter mais cinema, restaurante, blá, blá, blá. Então, você tem um tipo de amenidade. E aí, isso vai mudar um pouco o efeito modelo. Aí, a gente já estava com um modelo meio grande, então a gente pensou, não, primeiro vamos entender o básico, e a gente passou muito tempo tentando só entender como migração afeta a exportação. Assim. Depois que a gente passou um tempão abrindo as contas, a gente ficou claro, mas no começo, ex ante, não era claro como é que migração ia afetar. Basicamente porque se você tem migração para uma região, mas os migrantes vão igualmente para todos os setores, o custo marginal de todos os setores vai diminuir igual e você vai exportar igual para o resto do mundo. Então, tem algumas coisas que você tem que ter no modelo para conseguir gerar um efeito de migração e vantagem comparativa. E aí, a gente passou um tempão nisso e acho que agora está no momento que a gente pode, com mais conforto, ver assim, coloca uma amenidade com algum parâmetro da literatura para ver se isso muda muito o efeito, ou alguma aglomeração no destino. Isso dá para fazer. Mas... Não,
eu vi um pouco... vocês devem conhecer esse paper, acho que o cara foi aluno do Sebastião, né? O cara olhando para a Colômbia, a Rota do Ouro e o efeito de projeto... Essas que você conhece, né? É bem relacionado, né, ao projeto de vocês. Eu acho que a diferença aí seria colocar alguma estrutura, né, nos custos de mobilidade. Agora eu não lembro o paper da Colômbia, eu não lembro se era mobilidade de trabalhador ou era mobilidade de capital, o que era? Era custo de comércio?
Era custo de comércio, mas a história lá era mais assim, era mais de trabalhador em região com produtividade diferente e como isso afeta o agregado. Então, você coloca a estrada numa região que produz certos produtos, sei lá, soja, Então,
é um pouco diferente,
os trabalhadores vão para aquela região e aí no agregado o país vai parecer mais com maior vantagem comparativa naqueles produtos.
Sim.
Então, a gente tem um pouco disso, mas...
Mas então o teu... faz tempo que eu não vi o paper da Melanie Morton e da Jaqueline. Mas eles tinham também um quê disso, né? Mas eles parametrizavam os custos de mobilidade com relação a estradas para ver como é que estradas... mas eu não sei se eles estavam olhando para o mesmo tipo de pergunta que vocês.
Exato. Não, mas era lá não tem international trade lá, né? E não tem setor. Então é um setor e é basicamente ver se você teve uma integração de goods markets e labor markets. Qual que é a importância relativa da integração desses dois, as induced pelas estradas, né? Então tem uma ideia um pouco diferente lá. Não, mas é legal. Aquele artigo é um artigo legal. A gente usou... Tem bastante coisa lá que acabou ajudando a gente a pensar no que a gente está fazendo aqui.
Tranquilo.
Bom, valeu. Eu anotei tudo aqui.
Beleza. Aí eu tenho os comentários para o João.
Valeu, cara.
João, achei bastante interessante também, até porque à medida que você foi falando sobre o modelo, né, a gente sempre tem essa tendência de querer complicar as coisas na nossa cabeça, né? Então, você tem que descobrir esse balanço, né, entre, pô, será que eu incluo isso ou não? Mas tem várias coisas aqui que você... ou pelo menos uma coisa que eu fiquei pensando. Esse é um modelo em total equilíbrio parcial, né?
Isso, equilíbrio parcial.
Você não tem... Quer dizer, você não tem times. Você não está montando um time. Você não está olhando em complementariedades e nada do tipo, e você não está fechando isso em equilíbrio. Você tem lá
isso, exatamente.
Os times aleatórios lá.
Linkado com o trabalhador e, basicamente, essas mudanças de time vão afetar como ele decide se contrata o trabalhador ou não, tá sendo tudo capturado pelo C, né? Que é o processo.
Agora, obviamente, foi curto aqui, mas seria interessante você começar a pensar, pelo menos aqui. Por exemplo, você não tem persistência, né, nos 6.
Temos. Aqui não deu para mostrar, cara. Formal.
Ok. Você tem persistência nos 6, ok. O que mais que eu tenho aqui? Outra coisa... cara, não ficou claro como é que o seu modelo gera um age profile. Isso aí não...
cara...
Não capturei isso.
Pô, foi mal, cara. Vamos lá. A gente tem, né, digamos assim, uma vida exógena lá do trabalhador. O cara vai viver por N períodos, tá? Isso é um parâmetro lá do modelo. Então, basicamente, né, cara, ele vai seguindo a vida dele, né? Os seis vão mudando, e aí ele pode, os contratos podem ir vencendo.
O programa dinâmico de cada trabalhador muda.
Isso, exatamente. Vai mudando ao longo do tempo. E aí,
mas isso aí... Mas performance... Como é que é a performance do cara? Então, muda a performance do cara ou não?
A performance do cara vai mudar só se o C mudar, se o C dele mudar. O Y dele a gente já assume que é constante, meio que limpa lá dos dados, com efeito fixo, e assume que o Y é constante. Então, a performance dele, né, na produção do clube muda só porque o C está mudando e porque aquele parâmetro que é comum a todos os jogadores, o μT, está mudando também. Mas isso é um parâmetro, né? E é exógeno lá do modelo.
Mas então por que você tem o age profile? Por que você tem salários crescendo ao longo do tempo?
O salário vai crescendo ao longo do tempo porque, assim, né, basicamente, uma das fontes é que você vai tendo um aumentozinho de eficiência, né? Isso é claro no modelo. Por quê? Porque você vai mudando para matches melhores ao longo do tempo, né? Okay. Então, isso seria uma fonte, né? Além disso, o salário que os caras vão estar dispostos a pagar ao longo do tempo, né? Se o seu contrato vencer ou se você mudar de clube, vai mudando também, né? Você tende a pagar salários mais altos, digamos, para o 1.000 constante, né? Você tende a ter... Mas o 1.000 vai mudando muito ao longo do tempo na nossa estimação. Mas para o mesmo 1.000, você tende a pagar mais por um jogador mais novo, porque o cara é um asset value melhor para você ali. Tem mais tempo ao longo da vida, você pode vender aquele cara para outro clube e ganhar dinheiro com ele, ou ter aquele cara produzindo por mais tempo ali para você, né? Então, assim, acho que tem essas fontes aí, por que o salário vai mudando ao longo do tempo.
Cara, você tem evidência de que a mudança salarial acontece mais entre clubes do que within clubes? Talvez se ajudasse um pouco a motivar
Isso é
as
verdade,
hipóteses.
né? Tá. Mudança de salário entre clubes. Cara, eu acho que, realmente, eu não sei qual é o efeito de cada um dos componentes, mas certamente tem dos dois, né? A gente tem muito fato, né, anedotal de que quando o cara é transferido para um clube melhor, tem um baita aumento de salário, mas ele também renegocia salário dentro do clube, né? Tem bastante isso, mas ia ser legal saber realmente qual o componente dessas coisas, né? Tá. Mudança de salário. Tá, então, vou deixar mais claro porque tem esse wage profile mudando ao longo do tempo, né?
Isso.
E essa coisa do Heitor, beleza. Ao longo do tempo. Dentro e fora do clube. Você tinha falado também do contrato, né? O contrato é uma coisa que ia ser legal endogeneizar, mas a gente preferiu deixar a coisa um pouco mais simples, né? Mas
Não,
certamente uma coisa
exatamente.
importante.
De novo, eu acho fácil começar a especular e querer deixar o modelo complicado demais. Mas tem que descobrir o balanço perfeito. Vocês já terminaram? Terminou o paper? Você já tem draft? Não.
Cara, tá na boca para sair o draft, cara. Só falta ajustar o erro padrão aí que o Dudu tinha perguntado, né? Essa coisa. E, cara, eu nunca tinha parado para pensar isso, né? Acho que a gente faz em trade muita coisa, a gente caga para desvio padrão, né? Em geral.
Mas é difícil, não? Porque o
Pois
Dudu estava perguntando... Cara, não sei se você vai...
Cara, então, eu achei...
Esses modelos não lineares, é difícil você ter intervalo de confiança para policy responses, não?
Não digo nem para policy responses, é tipo assim, né, saindo da estimação, né, digamos. Eu penso assim, um passo antes.
Bootstrap,
né? Pois é, cara, eu nunca tinha parado para calcular realmente, né, quando a gente está fazendo né, tratando mediando os momentos, como é que a gente calcula o padrão nesses casos.
Não, mas peraí. Você pode computar, você faz o quê? Métodos de momentos?
Métodos de momentos, isso.
Mas você pode computar o desvio padrão, não é tão difícil. Você pode computar o desvio padrão das estimativas, isso é tranquilo.
É tranquilo, cara?
É tranquilo, você tem que serar para o problema. Inclusive, fazendo um advertisement aqui, se você olhar o meu paper na Econometria, se você for olhar no apêndice, o apêndice online tem, na verdade, uma descrição bem detalhada de como é que você faz. Né?
Bacana. Vou dar uma olhada.
Mas você faz isso de forma numérica. Você tem uma expressão da matriz de covariância assintótica, mas essa matriz de covariância vai ter que ser computada de forma numérica. Você tem que tirar umas derivadas numéricas.
Isso, perfeito.
E eu explico lá como é que eu fiz. Quais são os métodos que eu usei para computar essas.
Bom, bacana. Vou dar uma olhada lá.
Mas isso não interessa o comentário do Dudu, hein? Porque o Dudu ele quer que você...
Isso, de padrão do policy, né? Mas, assim...
Exatamente.
Mas eu imagino que eu acho que você tem que calcular para começar...
Deve ser mais difícil.
Deve ser mais difícil.
Inclusive, a galera de macro, toda essa história de log linearization e piriri pororó é justamente porque eles querem um modelo linear para poder colocar desvio padrão nas policies.
Entendi.
Se você tem um modelo não linear, cara, que é difícil de computar...
Cara, dá uma olhada. A Cecile Gobert e o Benjamin Faber, no paper sobre turismo, eles colocam os desvios padrões lá para os efeitos de welfare gain. No apêndice tem você assume que os dados vêm com erro, os dados que você está usando para calibrar o modelo vêm com erro, então você pode dar uma olhada lá no que eles fazem lá.
Legal, vou dar uma olhada.
Eu nunca fui no apêndice, eu lembro que eu vi foi o primeiro paper que eu vi o welfare gain de uma policy com desvio padrão, então talvez eles
O esquisito, cara, nunca tinha parado para pensar, né? Que os momentos vêm de dados diferentes, né? Então, assim, são observações diferentes que você está usando para calcular cada momento. Então,
tem um artigo de um cara de Princeton.
Isso, 2019, eu peguei esse cara, que ele pega um upper bound e um lower bound para desvio padrão de quando você usa essas coisas de momento. É isso que eu vou usar para calcular.
Porque o que acontece é que muita gente chama de GMM, não é GMM, na verdade métodos de inferência indireta, tal, porque você está usando estatísticas dos dados do modelo e estatísticas dos dados para estimar o modelo, não exatamente um momento que tem um erro claro lá.
Exatamente.
Então,
mas o João, isso aí é o seguinte, cara, você pode... eu acho o seguinte, uma coisa é... Você tem uma matriz de como você vai ponderar esses momentos na sua função de objetivo. Isso. Essa matriz é arbitrária, você pode escolher o que você quiser.
Beleza, isso.
E aí outra coisa é que você vai precisar da variância dos momentos.
Isso, boa.
E aí você vai precisar, quer dizer, em princípio, você vai precisar de como é que o erro desses dois momentos aqui estão correlacionados. Mas se esses momentos estão vindo de bases diferentes,
é foda,
cara,
né?
Bota zero.
Então,
é o que eu fiz no meu paper.
O paper do cara, ele fala o seguinte, ele faz exatamente isso, só que vamos pensar no pior caso e no melhor caso. O pior caso é quando você coloca 1, eu acho. E aí o pior caso, e aí vamos chamar um upper bound para variâncias estimativas. Mas, cara, o que você faz também acho que funcionaria legal. E se você está fazendo, é bom de citar, né? Vamos utilizar desvio padrão.
Eu acho que todo mundo faz isso, cara.
Legal, não sabia não. Exatamente isso. Esse que era o problema, cara. Como vem de dados diferentes, é foda calcular, né? Assim,
e deixa eu ser sincero com você. Agora, esse paper que eu tenho com a Penny e com Costas, cara, eu já falo assim, pô, eu não vou computar, a gente não vai computar desvio padrão das policy mesmo. Porra, eu não estou preocupado em desvio padrão eu não estou preocupado com desvio padrão dos coeficientes. Então, nesse paper, eu só vou computar desvio padrão se parecer isso se quiser. Eu não acredito mais nisso.
Eu acho que aí...
Pô, você não usa. Mas
eu vindo de trade, eu estava satisfeito. O Bernardo Macro estava muito feliz também sem desvio padrão. Mas agora o Vladimir, como é meio econometrista applied micro, já deu para prestar mais atenção para inferência e queria calcular, né? Mas cara, concordo, assim. Eu não vejo muita vantagem em fazer inferência com esses negócios.
Eu acho que o problema é que você quer saber se o determinado parâmetro do seu modelo é zero ou não, aí tudo bem. Mas se você está interessado em... Não, ok, esse é o parâmetro do modelo, deixa eu ver a resposta. Agora, eu concordo totalmente no comentário do Dudu. E no mundo ideal, você quer ver, né, essas duas policies, o resultado dessas duas policies são diferentes.
Né?
E aí, se você realmente quiser isso, aí você tem que entrar no processo todo. Mas esse processo é mais complicado do que
fazer desvio padrão estimativo.
99% da literatura faz. E a literatura de macro faz isso, de novo, porque eles fazem...
A log linearização. Né?
Exatamente.
Entendi. Boa. Não, bom ponto. Legal. Isso.
Senhores, foi um prazer. Heitor, você está em Abu Dhabi?
Em Abu Dhabi. Ainda jantar agora.
Como é que tá sendo aí?
Tá sendo tranquilo até. Então, o país eles fecharam muito cedo, antes de todos os outros países, né? E a NYU aqui fechou cedo. E aqui não tem problema de compliance, né? Então, tipo, chegaram, ter que ficar em casa, não sei o que e tal, e ficou. Então, os casos foram muito baixos, na verdade, em Abu Dhabi.
Você tá em casa agora? Você tá em casa ou tá no...
Não, eu tô no escritório. Porque a internet é um pouco melhor aqui, eu não queria ficar... E aí agora, com o negócio Covid, o único problema é que é muito difícil sair, sabe? Quando você volta para casa, você tem que fazer quarentena, e eles te colocam com um bracelete e tal, sabe? Cara, é um pouco tenso. Mas, assim, dentro de Abu Dhabi, dado que você está aqui, é quase que vida normal. Assim, restaurante, lugar...
Quando você começou aí?
Bom, eu comecei aqui faz 3 anos, né? Cara, assim, em termos de departamento, a coisa mudou muito, assim. No primeiro ano, assim, sendo bem honesto, eu estava bem, assim, óbvio, um emprego, eu estava feliz com isso, de ter sobrevivido, isso foi ótimo, mas eu não tinha um ambiente, assim, sabe, de almoçar, ter gente para conversar de pesquisa, tanto, sabe? Eu tive sorte que meus coautores, eu estava com bastante contato com eles, isso ajudou bastante. Mas aí, nos últimos 2 anos, contrataram bastante gente, então, o Jean Imbs, que é um cara que faz trade macro, que era da LC, depois foi para escutar aqui, o Kevin O'Rourke, que é de Trade, Economic History, está aqui. O Bob Allen, que é um cara mais de Economic History do que Trade, mas também veio para cá. Agora contratamos também o Jordan Norris, que trabalhava com Trebellen. Então, agora tem uma massa crítica, assim, sabe? Almoço, discussão, eu acho que
Mas agora? Agora não.
Agora não, né?
Almoçado não? Não.
Não, de vez em quando tem almoço, assim, mas é bem... Cara, nunca com 4 pessoas, uma pessoa ou outra, sabe? Com mais cuidado, assim. Mas os seminários, pelo menos, online estão cheios, então, sabe? Isso é legal.
E mudou o esquema aí, porque antigamente eles contratavam por curto prazo, né? Isso mudou ou não?
Não. É assistant professor normal. Tem third year review, tem não sei o quê, tem...
Mas acontecia isso, né? Que eles contratavam as pessoas só por 3 anos, algo assim?
Tinha bastante, sim.
Mas mudou
Mas
agora.
Não
Agora
tem
você
mais,
pode ficar
não
aí.
tem mais. Agora todos os contratos são normais, assim, digamos normais, né? São de tenure track. Abriu um mestrado aqui também, com a ideia mais de ter um mestrado, meio que nem a Pompeu Fabra, está querendo competir com a Europa, né? Pompeu Fabra, não sei o quê, para ter os alunos e depois mandar para a PhD. Então, as coisas estão mudando rápido aqui. É interessante. Então, assim, digamos, a minha opinião mudou bastante. Se eu tivesse me perguntasse isso há 2, 3 anos, eu ia ficar meio assim, responder com cuidado.
Entendi.
Agora, eu acho que eu diria, não, tá um departamento bem bacana, assim, tá expandindo, tem uma energia boa, assim, aqui.
E a vida? E a vida em Abu Dhabi?
A vida em Abu Dhabi...
Você tem família aí, não?
Tenho. Minha esposa está aqui e a gente não tem filho, né? Mas a vida aqui quando eu vim para cá, eu estava um pouco ansioso com isso, porque eu não conhecia nada da região. Se perguntasse para falar onde ficava cada país um mapa, eu ia errar, assim, sabe? Não sabia muito pouco, mas é bem cosmopolita, né? Assim, é muito mais do que imaginava. Então, assim, tem bastante restaurante, tem bastante bar. Mas é uma cidade realmente que é um pouco fake, assim. Então, assim, sabe, depois de uns 3 meses, você fica meio assim, sabe? Agora na quarentena, a gente tá meio assim, não aguento, porque é muito uma coisa, tipo, mais de resort, nos hotéis. Então, você tem hotéis legais, tem restaurantes legais, tem um monte de bares legais, tem uma vida bacana aqui, mas...
Foi aí que aprovaram bebida agora, Heitor? Pode beber?
Não. Sempre foi
Sempre
aprovado.
pôde,
Só que você
sempre
precisava de uma
pôde.
carteirinha para provar a sua religião. Então, assim,
Provar a religião. Qual é a sua? Você é religioso, não?
Não, aqui eu sou católico.
Minha carteirinha de ateu.
Minha carteirinha de ateu aqui. Então, eu antes precisava. Só que, cara, isso aqui, assim, tem tudo. Que nem todo lugar, assim, tem essas coisas meio assim que é para inglês, para lei para inglês ver, assim, que é para falar, não, aqui tem essas coisas, mas ninguém nunca pediu essa carteirinha para mim. Eu já comprei várias vezes, tem umas liquor store aqui, nunca ninguém pediu. Mas agora parece que não precisa mesmo. Agora eles desencanaram e você não precisa de carteirinha, nada, você pode comprar sem precisar provar a sua religião. Tinha umas coisas, por exemplo, você podia comprar até 2% do seu salário em álcool. Mas, cara, quem é que vai olhar isso aqui? Não tem ninguém, sabe? Umas coisas que eles... Cara, eu acho que tem umas coisas de economia política que a gente está num país assim que não tem... Um cara me falou isso, ele falou, cara, você mora num país que não tem problema de fronteira. Você não sabe o que é. Aqui, você tem a Arábia Saudita de um lado, o Irã do outro, não sei o quê. Você tem que ser muito cuidadoso, assim, com a forma como a imagem que você passa para esses países que tem do seu lado, que aqui não é só um lugar muito western, assim, que é um lugar que está tentando ter uma integração entre povos, tal. Então eles têm que ter um cuidado que muitos outros lugares não têm, né? E é um lugar nanico, assim, no meio. Então, realmente, se sei lá, tem uma briga com a Arábia Saudita, não sei o quê, imagina, só que tem muito soft power aqui a região, cara. Isso eu não sabia tanto, mas tem muito europeu, assim, muito francês, né? Então, também gente da Ásia, China, muito. Então, cara, é um. Agora teve eles fizeram acordo lá de paz entre Israel e primeiro país a reconhecer Israel como Estado, né? Então a gente está tendo seminário toda semana com algumas universidades de Israel agora.
Caraca.
E vocês conseguem? Vocês viajaram aí? Como é que é?
Não, o budget para viajar não, ele assim, cara.
Não, cara, para você.
Mas,
pessoalmente.
Turismo.
Para viajar? Não, viajei. Fui para a Geórgia, eu e minha esposa. Cara, é muito legal. Ela estava fazendo um projeto com o Banco Mundial lá, a gente foi para lá. Mas quando ela veio para cá esse ano, e a gente estava assim, tipo, quando você vier para cá, a gente vai viajar, vai para Singapura, vai para não sei o quê, né?
Cara, Israel, quer dizer, eu não sei quão perto é Israel, não é longe não, né?
Cara, 3 horas aqui.
Cara, Israel e Jordânia são muito legais, cara. Eu recomendo fortemente. Jordânia,
cara, eu muito.
Cara, Petra é sensacional, cara. Vale muito
Petra,
a pena.
né? Então, eu fiz essa viagem aqui, fui pro deserto aqui, não sei o quê. Tem umas coisas legais. Fui para Geórgia, e cara, foi isso, na verdade. Fui para Espanha uma vez, assim, meio. Poderia ir dos Estados Unidos também, mas é relativamente perto aqui. Essas coisas. 5, 6 horas no máximo.
Entendi.
Então, mas esse ano era o ano. E aí, enfim, eu morro de vontade de ir para o Japão, cara. Ou para Tailândia também queria ir, mas eu estava até preparado. Eu estava comendo comida apimentada aqui no começo do ano, antes de ver o Covid, porque a gente queria ir em março.
Tá treinando para Tailândia.
Eu estava comendo as coisas mais apimentadas que era para começar a treinar. Eu falei, não quero ir para lá, isso é aqueles caras que não conseguem comer nada, sabe? E aí, enfim. Bem.
É só de aula, vai pegar de um pouco.
Enfim, mas eu passo, eu não sei, agora eu passo muito tempo nos Estados Unidos também. Desde que eu venho para cá, porque minha esposa estava em Washington, né? No Banco Mundial. E agora está aqui, então, por exemplo, ano que vem a gente deve passar 4, 5 meses lá também.
Legal.
De novo. Se nada, né?
Sua esposa é economista ou não?
Fez relações internacionais, depois fez mestrado em economia. Ela é meio... Ela não admite, mas ela é um pouco economista.
Mas ela trabalha a minha esposa trabalha no banco também. Ela não é economista.
Ela trabalha no IFC agora.
No IFC.
Ela está no projeto no IFC junto com o Vietnã. Mas ela está trabalhando naqueles projetos com contratos de consultoria. Então,
minha esposa também fez isso quando veio para cá.
E agora ela está ela é staff do banco?
Não, ela era. Aí quando ela veio para Dorma, ela tem um contrato agora tem rolling contracts, né?
Rolling contracts, Então, é isso que... a Raquel tá no mesmo esquema. Então não precisa estar lá mesmo, assim. É bom ir de vez em quando, tal, para ter... Mas depende um pouco do projeto, né? Ela falou que para o projeto agora é até melhor estar aqui, porque as reuniões com o Vietnã são todos em horários muito ruins com o Washington. E aqui é mais fácil, durante os horários normais. Enfim, não, mas assim, o que eu queria fazer agora que está com uma massa crítica, o Jamin, não sei o que, era fazer uma conferência de trade grande aqui, junto com ele, não sei o que.
Isso é legal, né?
Aí eu falava isso, mas agora não sei se vai rolar, sei lá quando a gente vai conseguir organizar esse negócio aí.
Esse negócio de viagem realmente vai demorar um pouco, acho que para...
Eu acho que vai ter uma certa persistência nas mudanças, cara, no sentido de que, pelo menos aqui, cara, tem uma chance do budget ser um pouco menor para viagem, porque, sei lá, muita coisa vai ficar online mesmo. Não sei, cara.
Mas é verdade, você consegue fazer essas conferências online, mas não é a mesma coisa, cara.
Não é a mesma
e outra coisa, a interação sofre e outra coisa, eu não absorvo, eu não consigo eu não consigo focar
O
por mais
span de
uma
atenção é muito menor, cara, muito menor, assim, né? Tipo, você não dá para ficar prestando atenção 2 horas online.
Não dá.
E acho que tem muita ideia que, assim, de trabalho. Eu, por exemplo, o Sebastião, a gente virou coautor por causa de uma conferência, assim, mas depois a gente sai, conversa e passa. Você também quer saber, sei lá, conversa, se dá. Porque tem a ver com uma complementaridade em termos do que cada um tem interesse, mas também como é que você se dá com a pessoa, sei lá. E aí nas conferências, eles têm aquele esquema lá, você já viu? Que você teve das conferências lá do pessoal do Ethos, do Fret, eles tinham esse esquema que era tipo um videogame, que você andava com um avatar no cenário.
O Gather,
O Gather. Mas sei lá, eu usei isso 2 vezes, achei muito engraçado.
Artificial, né? Muito artificial, né?
Muito artificial, tá? Sei lá. Então, sei. No final, aquele negócio...
Ixi, vamos travar a sala aqui, cara.
Ok.
Tá bom.
Senhores,
gente, super obrigado aí, cara. Fiquei muito feliz aí de ter vocês, cara, na sessão. Valeu mesmo aí, cara.
Grande abraço.
Aceitar o convite, cara. Abração.
Valeu, João. Valeu, Heitor.
Tchau.
Tchau.
Valeu.